Okay, Joe. Good afternoon and welcome to the Corporation of the Town of Kirkland Lake special meeting of council, June 14th, 2016. I have a notice to read before the meeting starts. At its regular meeting of June the 21st, 2016, council will consider bylaws to sell 38 Hudson Bay Avenue, 9 and 13 King George Court. We have the approval of the agenda. Was moved by Councillor Morgan and seconded by Councillor Kiley that council approves the agenda for its special meeting of June the 14th, 2016 as presented. All in favor? Thank you. Is there any declaration of pecuniary interest? None declared. Petitions and delegations. Tonight we have Oscar Poloni. Welcome from KPMG, and Oscar is going to give us the final report for the service delivery and operational review. So welcome back to Kirkland Lake again, Oscar, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to present. The presentation that I would like to make to Council tonight concerns our reports from an open session and a closed session perspective. And one of the things that I want to stress is we consider these reports to be draft because what we are requesting is the opportunity to sit down with council members on an individual basis to make sure that our report gives you what you need as council members to make your decision. So pending the outcome of those interviews, this report is technically draft, Your Worship. So for the purposes of tonight's presentation, what I'd like to do is provide a bit of an overview as to what we're attempting to accomplish tonight, talk a little bit about the current state of the town and how you compare to other municipalities, and then discuss some of the key themes that came out of our review and some of the opportunities that arose as a result of them, and then talk about next steps. And Your Worship, pursuant to the provisions of the Municipal Act, items relating to identifiable individuals or that have the ability to impact on labor relations can be discussed in closed session. And we've made the request through your CAO and your clerk to have a closed session presentation to discuss some of those matters arising out of our review as well. So, as I've mentioned, Your Worship and members of council, the purpose of tonight's presentation really is to introduce our draft report and highlight some of the key points from our review. It is 102 pages long, so it is fairly thick chunk of reading, and what I wanted to do today was sort of lay the groundwork for council's review of the report. And as I've mentioned, this really is the first step in council's review and decision making coming out of this report. After this presentation is done, we'll leave you to read it at your leisure, after which time we'd like to schedule individual interviews once again with KPMG, and when I say KPMG I mean me. And the purpose of these interviews is a couple of things. One is to see if you have any questions concerning the analysis or the conclusions in our report. We'd like to be able to answer them, and if necessary, amend the report accordingly. If there's additional research or analysis that members of council had expected to see and didn't see in the report, then we would be very happy to take the opportunity to flag that and close the loop on this. What I want to do and what I need to do is to make sure that as elected officials, you have the information that you need to make the decisions that you need to make with respect to the upcoming 2017 budget process. Once the council interviews are complete, we'll update our draft report to address whatever additional research may be in, what direction we receive from council in terms of which opportunities make sense and which don't. And given the time frame that we're looking at right now, we may update some of the numbers. We expect that there's going to be a release of more current information, both with respect to the town's operations and your comparator municipalities. So we will update some of the financial analysis just to bring everything more current. That way you have a more current report. In terms of some of the current state analysis. And I'd like to do this very briefly because, Council, clearly you understand your municipality probably as well as everyone. You spend on an annual basis somewhere between $25 and $26 million to run the municipality and deliver your services. What you see is approximately 50% of that relates to wages and benefits. And consistent with other municipalities and most public sector organizations, you're a people business. What we've summarized in the report and what we've shown on this slide is a summary of your reported costs over the last 5 years, from 2011 to 2015. What you'll see is from 11 to 14, your costs have gone up on average about 3%. And what you'll notice is in 2015, the cost of running this municipality has actually gone down. It's gone from about $26.7 million to $26.2 million. The reason for that is you will see there's about an $800,000 decrease in your wages and benefit lines. There were a number of positions that were vacant in the current year that weren't filled, and so as a result you benefited from lower salary costs. From a taxation perspective, this is an update to a graph that we would have presented earlier in our interim review, and what we've done here is we've removed approximately 600 properties that are vacant lots. And what this is intended to do is to provide a better indication as to what an occupied household will pay from a tax perspective and what their assessment will be. And just for the information of council, the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation assigns a variety of codes to properties depending on their type. Anything that starts with a 1 is a vacant lot. So what we did was we went through the 3,000 or so properties that the municipality has on its tax roll and pulled out anything that was vacant land. What you will see is that roughly 70% of the properties in the town of Kirkland Lake have assessed values of $100,000 or less, whereas 935 properties, or about 31%, have assessed values of $100,000 or more. And this is important because it drives tax rate. And we've had discussions in the past at the council table concerning the importance of tax rates and the potential for it to be a deterrent for people that are looking at coming into the community or people that are looking to build. From a municipal tax perspective and a residential tax perspective, if you remove 600 properties that are vacant lots, what you will do is if you go back and forth and compare the graphs, you'll notice that the number of taxpayers that pay less than $500 for properties has gone down considerably. And so what you'll see from this graph is roughly 54% of residential taxpayers in the municipalities pay $2,000 or less in terms of residential taxes. An additional 25% pay somewhere between $2,000 to $3,000 a year in municipal taxes, while 21% or 627 properties pay $3,000 or more. And for the sake of confidentiality, I'm not going to discuss what the more than 5,000 number looks up at. I'm not particularly inclined to disclose what people's property taxes are. On average, though, what you will find is that your average municipal taxes are somewhere in the range of $2,000. So that's the township, and what you will notice from the report is we've attempted to provide a summary and an overview of the municipality's functional areas. So all of the various departments that build up to your total municipality. And what we've also done in the analysis is we've benchmarked you against 5 other municipalities that we consider to be comparable to you and appropriate for comparison. And these include Temiskaming Shores, Kapuskasing, Dryden, Elliott Lake, and Fort Francis. And what you will notice from the analysis, and it's in every departmental chapter, is in some cases your costs are higher than the comparative municipalities. In some cases, your costs are consistent with the comparative municipalities. And in some cases, not very many, your costs are actually lower than the comparative municipalities. And in certain cases, and we will discuss this later, the reason why some of your costs are higher, particularly with respect to Heritage North, Tech Pioneer Residence, and your childcare program, is these are services that most of the other communities, and in some cases none of the other communities, actually provide. So you're not necessarily higher because of an efficiency issue, you're higher because of a service level determination. For example, of the 6 municipalities included in the comparison, including yourselves, 3 offer direct childcare services. Of the 3 that offer direct childcare services, 1 of them funds it 100% through user fees, so there's no support from the municipal levy. The other one has a net municipal support of about $60 per household, which is consistent with yours. What you will find is that of the 6 municipalities that are included in the comparative analysis, none of them directly support a long-term care facility. So it's not necessarily that you're inefficient. In some cases, it's a service level issue. And from a comparative perspective, one of the other things that we've looked at is your tax position. And council will recall in the past, we did do an analysis of average taxes per residential household and how you fared, and we identified the fact that you were on the low end of the scale. The presentation that we discussed indicated that you had the 2nd lowest taxes per household. And if council will recall from our initial conversation about how we pick the comparator, there's a variety of factors that influence taxes. And the reality, council, is this: you are doomed by the nature of your assessment base to have high tax rate in comparison to your other municipalities. Despite the fact that the taxes per household are lower, the nature of your tax base and your assessment base will always result in a higher tax rate. So if you believe that tax rate is a determinant to people moving into this community, and if you believe that it's a determinant in the case of people who choose to construct new homes, there's an issue here. And so to give you an example of why this is, we've put together this chart. And very simply, we haven't tried to use very many real numbers. We've just said this: assume, if you will, that each of the municipalities in the comparison group have to raise $10 million in municipal taxes. Assume they're all spending the same amount. Because of differences in terms of how much of their assessment is residential versus non-residential, they will have different amounts of this fall to the residential taxpayer. In the case of Kirkland Lake, using the numbers that we had, it was 75% of the time. So raising $10 million would require the town of Kirkland Lake to raise $7.5 million in this scenario off of residential taxpayers. A community like Elliott Lake, with 85% residential assessment, would be forced to raise $8.5 million off of residential taxpayers. Doesn't mean they're less efficient, because at the end of the day, the levy's the same amount. They will naturally have more pressure on the residential taxpayers because they have more assessment. A town like Kapuskasing, with 68%, will only be forced to raise $6.8 million. Now, here's the challenge that you face. From a community perspective, despite the fact that you have a similar number of households than most of these communities in the comparator group, the reality is your assessment is significantly undervalued in proportion to them. You have roughly 4,000 homes, and your residential assessment is $213 million. Dryden has roughly 4,000 homes. Their residential assessment is $429,000. So even though you're raising a same amount for residential taxes as everybody else, and even though you're equally as efficient because everybody's raising $10 million, what you'll find is that your tax rate will be more than double. 3.52% versus 1.6, 1.7, in some cases 2% in the other municipalities. Now, this is admittedly a hypothetical scenario, but the assessment numbers are real. So that percentage residential to non-residential is real, and the value of the assessment is real. And what that means, council, is despite the fact that your taxes will be the second lowest in the comparator group, next to Elliott Lake, on a per household basis, your residential tax rate will be higher. And I know there was conversation at the last meeting, and I know there's continued conversation about the pressure from a residential tax perspective and what that means in terms of affordability. And there was discussions about new home construction. Since 2010, there's been a total of 17 houses that have been constructed in the town of Kirkland Lake. The assessed values range anywhere from the hundreds of thousands of dollars to upwards to the mid $300,000. The challenge that you have is this. If MPAC assesses homes based on their actual construction value of $200 to $300 per square foot times 5,000 square feet, you will drive assessment values in the tune of $600,000, $700,000, $800,000. And if you apply a 3.5% or a 3% tax rate to that, you will very much result in a scenario where somebody's paying $24,000 in tax for a new home. That is, admittedly, a concern. It would be a concern to me if I was a counselor, be a concern to me if I was a resident. What we're seeing and what we believe is happening is MPAC is actually discounting the assessment. Because MPAC values based on market comparables, and so it's not necessarily what it cost you to build your house, it's what you could potentially sell your house for, and the real proxy for that is what the guy down the street sold his house for. And what we're finding is the assessed values on the new home construction don't appear, from our perspective, to be reflective of construction costs. So what we're seeing is, yeah, you're being tagged with a very high tax rate, but your assessed value is actually depressed, much like the rest of the community. So at the end of the day, you should fare well if you take that house and try to build it in another community, because they'll have a lower tax rate, but MPAC will ding them with a higher assessment. And if you want the purest example of this, Council, 2 years ago I bought a house. I know what I paid for it. I know what I renovated it for. MPAC's assessed value is 75% of what I invested in my house. And the reality is I won't get my money out of my house. So they're not necessarily penalizing me from a tax perspective. And I know, Your Worship, on the part of some councillors, there was the discussion about whether it's a deterrent or not. It's a real issue. And where it really comes to play isn't necessarily in the dollars and cents, but it's in the communication and the understanding and how you position the municipality. Because if everybody turns around and pulls your FIRs and looks at your residential tax rates, they're going to say, there's no way I'm coming through this. If people have an impression that I'm going to spend X to build a house, and that's going to form the basis of my tax base, it becomes a deterrent. The real question that you have is, what's it going to be assessed at? The challenge that you have, in fairness to everybody, is you don't really know until MPAC assesses it. And that then becomes the challenge. So it is a valid concern on the part of council, and I think what it does is it provides rationale and support for the whole premise of the review in the first place. Ensure that your levy is controlled, it's not unnecessarily high, and that you have a community that's viable and attractive to people from an inbound perspective. If that makes sense.
Okay, you have the assumed residential tax rate, but is that adjusted to, for example, some have SOAR, like we have the SOAR included in the tax rate, some don't.
Through you, Your Worship, not yet, Councillor.
Okay, so it's not adjusted.
It's not adjusted.
Okay, so that's sort of, Thank you.
So from a themes perspective, I'm not proposing for the purposes of this meeting to go through 78 pages of analysis, but rather what I'd like to do is I'd like to highlight 4 things that came out clear from our analysis. We've had the opportunity to work with your staff across multiple departments, multiple functions. It's very clear to us that there is a focus on cost containment and value for money. People are looking at the ability to say, how can we reduce costs? How can we demonstrate efficiencies? What we also note, though, is that the issue that you spoke about, Councillor, adds $200 to the average tax bill in the town of Kirkland Lake. And we've talked about this before. This is about 10% of your municipal levy. So with an average residential tax rate of $2,100, it's $210 off of the tax bill. We understand that the municipality is currently in the process of conducting a rate study and finalizing a rate study for water and wastewater services with the expectation that you're going to move this off of the tax levy. Council, I can only say that we think that is a great idea. What we would suggest is you may want to look at potentially staggering it over a couple of different years just to ensure that you don't shock the system. But at the end of the day, in our report, we've actually provided some considerations as to how you do this move, because we've seen other municipalities do this in the past. One of the things that we discussed with your staff is that if you have large ICI, industrial, commercial, institutional customers that don't receive wastewater services, they're going to benefit from this because it's on their tax bill now. When you go to full cost recovery, it's not going to be on their tax bill. In my hometown, what the municipality did is they negotiated donations from Inco and Falconbridge, what they were called at the time, because they have private wastewater services. When you pull this off of the tax bill, they get a tax reduction and there's no increase in the user fees. And what they managed to do was negotiate a series of donations over 3 years in order to allow you to phase that in and offset some of that impact. I don't know what the nature of your properties look like, wastewater, no wastewater, but we've suggested it to your staff as part of their consideration. The other thing that we note is that there are a number of discretionary services that are not delivered by other municipalities. And what this adds is roughly 15% to the municipal levy. And I will caution council, there's a number of services that by their definition are purely discretionary in nature. You don't have to have a library. You don't have to have an arena. You don't have to offer parks and recreation programming. Those services, despite the fact that they're discretionary, are expected. So you don't really have a choice. What I'm talking about here are services that are both discretionary and aren't offered by other municipalities. And what this does is this puts a 15% premium on living in Kirkland Lake, because these are services that in other communities are not delivered by the municipality. So if you think about it, I've got a 10% pressure because of wastewater. I've got a 15% pressure because of discretionary services. Those two factors account for one of $4 that I pay in residential taxes if I live in this community. So it's a matter of attention, a matter of focus. The last point that I want to make is we've spent a lot of time working with your staff to go through how they process things, how they process payroll, how they process checks, how they maintain fleet. This is a key finding and a key theme that we find in every operational review and service delivery review. The processes have certain aspects of them that we would call inefficient, in that we've got multiple people performing the same task. There's duplication of efforts. There's an absence of technology where you're writing things down in hard copy or Excel spreadsheet when you could be using your systems. And there are some aspects of your organization that are characterized by weaknesses from an internal control perspective. And I've mentioned this before, Your Worship and Council, and I'll mention this again. This is not unusual. And your staff are actually taking the time to address these systems and put these systems in place, but it does take time. But the reality, council, is this, and I have a fetish with gas. I think it's fairly safe to say that you have very little to no control over the fuel that you have in your public works depots. And the only thing stopping people from stealing from you is their honesty. And that's not a big number in the grand scheme of things, but at the end of the day, it's taxpayer dollars. And so because of that, we're providing your staff with some suggestions on how to close that loop. So from an opportunities perspective, and I want to remind council that there are some opportunities that are disclosed in closed session because they deal with identifiable individuals or impact on labor relations. And so because of that, you're not going to see everything here. There are some room for user fee increases with respect to parks and recreation, specifically in the area of ice during what we call shoulder seasons into the summertime. There's the ability to recover more from your building inspection services. Wastewater services, we've discussed this about how you're funding it through the levy where everybody else is funding it through user fees. And The town collects waste from ICI, industrial, commercial, institutional customers. Normally, that's not provided by municipalities. That's provided by third-party private sector contractors. And so, which the ICI customer will pay directly. It's not on the tax bill. By virtue of your contractual arrangements, you're locked into providing this service, and that's fine. What we suggest, though, is that you make sure you set your user fee appropriately. Don't give the service away. From a service level reduction, some of the reductions that we flagged for council's attention, currently you maintain your airport to a certain standard that's required to ensure that you can meet federal regulations for airports that have regular scheduled passenger service. I think the likelihood of getting passenger service in the near term in the town of Kirkland Lake is fairly limited. So the question is why are you maintaining it to a higher standard than you need to? Your landfill currently operates 54 hours a week. The other municipalities operate anywhere between 40 to 49 hours a week. And so the question that we have is, do you want to continue to operate a landfill with the highest hours in the comparator group, or do you want to look at cutting that back? You could look potentially at winter hours versus summer hours. You could look potentially at carving back on the weekends, that type of stuff. Council, the only thing I can say is in comparison to your peer group, you have some fairly generous landfill hours, so you may want to look potentially at carving that back. That way you can save on the equipment wear and tear. That way you can save on the labor costs associated with operating a landfill 54 hours a week. Process improvements, as I've mentioned, there's some duplicate efforts that we've identified that we believe you may want to address. There's instances in this municipality where people will type information on a piece of paper and give it to another person so that they can type it on a piece of paper. There are internal control issues, as we've mentioned, with respect to fuel, with respect to procurement, with respect to other issues, and manual processes that, frankly, we believe you can eliminate. And once again, Council, I want to reiterate two things on this. I can go anywhere and find this, and I've found it everywhere we go, including places like the city of Barrie. So this isn't an unusual outcome. What this reflects is the fact that municipal processes get tacked on and develop over time, and things fall through the cracks. The second thing is your staff are already starting to address some of these. We know by working with your treasurer that there's a process in place with respect to procurement to tie that down as well. So it's not like this is necessarily news to anybody. It's just when we come in and we kick the tires, this is the type of stuff that we find. So in terms of next steps, and once again, apologies for the repetition, we'd like you to review the report, all 102 pages. We will then be scheduling council interviews. They will be one-on-one interviews, and they will be conducted in person in Kirkland Lake, and they will be between you and I. And then what we'd like to do is we'd like to update the report for the input, update the report for any new information that comes available, and then finalize it for release so that your staff can then take direction from council as to where to proceed next. Your worship, members of council, that concludes the open session of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at this time.
Because it's an open meeting, are there questions from the audience? Oh, that was short and sweet.
There's 3 KPMGers in the crowd, so they better sit down. So.
Well, we certainly appreciate you coming today and giving us a shortened version of the 102 pages. What I can tell you is we will be studying the 102 pages, and we'll be meeting on it. And we'll try to set from there a direction that we believe that we should be heading, as well as in regards to you returning to do some additional interviews. Do you have any time frame in mind? Or?
I serve at the pleasure of council. I can be back here next week if you'd like me to.
Okay. 102 pages is not a weekend reading material. Councillor Kiley.
Yes, Oscar, this package here is just a highlighted version. It's not the whole. this is the whole package? Okay. Is this going to go on our website for the public to be able to review that? Okay, because it's gonna take a while to digest all this, I agree.
Understood.
Yeah.
Through you, your worship, the only thing worse than writing these things is having to read them, so my sympathies.
Yes, please stand up and state your name and your address.
Basically, there wasn't anything that really come out tonight for a taxpayer point of view. After you talk to council and everything, and you get their views on it, is there anything gonna come out to explain to the taxpayer really what went on? Because what we're being told tonight is nothing. Right?
Yeah, you're hearing a very shortened portion of the 102 pages. I believe the 102 pages is open to everyone.
And through you, your worship, this isn't everything because there's still the closed session report.
Of course.
No, my question is why isn't some of that being discussed tonight so that when the people read it, we can understand what we're reading?
Certainly.
At this point right now, when we go to read this, we're not gonna know what we're reading and why we're reading it, and is there gonna be an opportunity to ask questions on it?
Well, I think the first thing that has to happen is council has to read this report as well. We just got this report as we came in here today. So everybody has to read this report. If you would like to read it, I'm sure there's a hard copy you could take. If you have any questions, please, you can take those questions up with your council reps, and we can go forward from there.
So I was under the impression that maybe you guys had already read it and there would be questions
Yeah.
coming out so the taxpayer would have something to come to a meeting for.
Certainly. I was just, you were under the wrong impression. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. It was moved by Councillor Kiley and seconded by Councillor Morgan that council adjourn to special meeting of June the 14th, 2016 to an in-camera meeting to receive personnel report from the KPMG organizational review. All in favor? Thank you.